Have you ever noticed that the term power fantasy is becoming increasingly more derogatory than it used to? That and misattributed as well. It pains me that some people like to call various stuff as male power fantasy or female power fantasy, as those things, while do exist, are quite rare, because for the most part people make power fantasies for a specific demographic, and sex is a very shitty way to classify a demographic, with it being basically the lowest common denominator. For example, think on what some people think as an average male power fantasy. A buff 8-pack hulk of a man with a big sword and a big-titted wench near him, but I'm more than certain at least 3 people from my audience will go, well, wait a gosh darn minute, this isn't what I want to be something else. And that's my point. People don't have a universal power fantasy. They have fantasies according to their age, culture, desires, and taboos. Hence why older people wish to be a mafia member, more than 30 to 40-year-olds want to become a typical 80s action hero, and millennials want to be Rick from Rick and Morty. Arifureta from Commonplace to World's Strongest is a 13-episode isekai harem anime developed by White Fox and Ass-Read about Nagumo Hajime, a Chunibu power fantasy, only this time played as seriously as humanly possible. The plot premise is simple. An entire class of Japanese school children was transported into a fantasy world, and our hero gets the most basic bitch class possible, that of a crafter, which in turn makes him a victim of constant ridicule and spite. Then, during a dungeon raid, one especially spiteful classmate targets a magical bolt at him and drops him in the unexplored parts of the dungeon. There, after having his hand eaten by a bear, he develops an edgy personality and starts being, let's call it quite liberal with his abilities, creating revolvers and other gunpowder-based weaponry in a medieval sort of world. And you get the drill by now, really. It's basically the other quarter of isekai stories, the ones that don't give their protagonists superpowers from the get-go, but the result is ultimately the same. The plot suffers from the same things Fairy Gun suffers, in that its pacing is all over the place, and sometimes I think the show is deliberately taking the piss. The first episode immediately throws us into the thick of it. Nothing explained, and what's explained is done in the most haphazard way possible. Who are we? The weakest of heroes. Where are we? A fantasy kingdom. How did we came here? A god sent you. They use you away. Now stop asking stupid questions and get disillusioned by life, you stupid Japanese twat. Initially I thought that it's going to be a sort of 2-element story. One part focuses on Hajime's survival in the dungeon, while the other is about the rest of his classmates trying to cope and get stronger, but that plot is almost immediately defenestrated and never seen again until the finale. The latter parts of the show aren't getting any better, as first half of it is meandering about in one dungeon, while afterwards they skip almost 1-2 story arcs worth of development in 3 episodes, making some additions to the story feel at best obligatory, at worst undesired, the hero's harem being a peculiar mix of both. The graphics are surprisingly cheap, with 3D being the worst offender, though trust me, the drawings aren't any better. Whoever in White Fox is responsible for 3D modeling should be fired into the sun at worst, or at best never be used outside of miscellaneous background. They did the same shit with Goblin Slayer, only at least in Goblin Slayer they had the brain power to turn off the blur from their models. Here they look as if these dungeons have a dedicated team of stylists. If there is something I did like, it's the music and the overall design of the characters. Combined, it for some reason strongly reminded me of a cheap Devil May Cry clone. And come to think of it, Hajime wouldn't look out of place in a Devil May Cry game either. Unfortunately, design-wise, Hajime feels out of place compared to his class and later additions to his harem, but then again he started looking out of place the second he created a revolver in a fantasy world. Unfortunately, in regards to harem, Yue, the first girl, has the most chemistry with our main hero, partially because she had the biggest amount of screen time, partially because other girls either feel underutilized or are basically one-note characters you've seen in other animes by this point. Sometimes the music can start a bit out of place tone-wise as well, but overall it's a nice action soundtrack to listen to, if a bit inappropriate within the setting in my opinion. Overall I had fun watching it, but I can't exactly say I enjoyed it or can recommend in an unironic fashion. This is a very cheaply made, poorly paced edge-fest of an anime, created if not for a quick buck, then by people who had very little respect for the source material, provided that the source material wasn't as abysmal. If you really want to see the anime, I would suggest watching only till episode 5, as that feels most complete, and then either forget about it until the inevitable second season, or go watch Devil May Cry anime instead.